Thank you all for coming today. Let me first say this is a celebration of a very special person who has touched many lives in remarkably different ways. My name is George Dover. I am the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics, and I came to Hopkins 2 years after Peter. When I started here, he started in 1972 the Lipid Clinic, the Pediatric Lipid Clinic. And so my tenure here lasted as long as the Lipid Clinic, but the Lipid Clinic, as you'll hear later, will last a lot longer than me. So thank you all for being here today. It is customary in formal academic settings to go through a summary of a CV of an individual. But what I thought we should do today is celebrate, okay, and discuss some of the things, our own personal remembrances of Peter, and some of the impacts that he's had on us, but what I think will come out is the impacts he's had on other people. Foremost, though, I want to thank the family for being here today, his wife Martha and their 2 children, Adam and Shelton, and Peter's other 3 children, Chris Ann, Peter Kwiterovich III, and Karen. And I think we have grandchildren here today. These include James, perhaps Charles, Charlotte, Peter the Fourth, Sloan, and Peter's sisters, Pamela and Deborah. Thank you all for being here. You honor us by your presence, and it makes this ceremony for us and this celebration all the more meaningful. I would like to start off this celebration of Peter not by reciting his CV, but some personal remembrances, since I do go back quite a long time with him. When I first came to Hopkins, there was a rumor that there was a new faculty member who actually, about halfway through his SAR year, became a faculty member. To my knowledge, no one had ever transformed from a third-year resident to a full-time faculty member before Peter, or for that matter, after Peter. I did get to meet Peter first when, as a hematology fellow, I worked up a patient with a genetic disorder, A-beta lipoproteinemia. To hematologists, that was called acanthocytosis. And I thought, and I confused that diagnosis with some of the things Peter was working on, and I remember going to talk to him about it. First, as you will hear from many, Peter loved to teach, and he loved to talk about his area of work. And this was very early in his career, and I can remember spending at least an hour with Peter that day. I'm not certain I learned a lot more about the disease I went to talk to him about, but I learned a heck of a lot about lipids that day, more than I ever thought I would ever be interested in, because in those days, frankly, very few of us were necessarily interested in lipid levels. The second occasion that I want to talk about is that I've had the privilege for the last 20 years of reviewing with Peter his faculty and his plans and his aspirations each year, as I do with all the faculty. And so I got to talking to him probably in a less formal way than I did with many other faculty, more junior faculty. And we talked about a lot of things. And what you learn from these conversations over years is a great deal about the true person, not just the academic person, but the person and what he loves to do and what he's most proud of. And so I have here Peter's last annual evaluation. Now the way this works is Peter fills this out first himself, so these are Peter's words. And then we discuss the things. And as I was looking through and trying to think about something to say about Peter, I asked him to list the things that were most important to him. And here is what he said. I'm still director of the Lipid Clinic. The clinic has moved from the Rubenstein building to the cardiology space. The day will be changed from Wednesday to Tuesday, and I'm not certain how well I'll adapt to that. We get used to certain days. Pediatric patients with dyslipidemias are often complex, especially if they have dyslipidemia secondary to other conditions. And he wanted to teach me a few, so he said nephrotic syndrome, chronic renal failure, type 1 diabetes, congenital biliary atresia, and asparaginase treatment for acute lymphocytic leukemia. He always would take an opportunity to make certain that there was a little bit of teaching, even in his summary of his works. And then he says very tellingly, this provides me a chance to interact not only with a terrifically diverse group of parents and their families, but also with a variety of faculty members and their fellows. I enjoy this. He then said, it's very important that I have cardiology fellows routinely rotating through the clinic as part of a preventive cardiology rotation. I spend a lot of time teaching them one-on-one, giving them articles, discussing their research interests, writing some review articles with them and Dr. Blumenthal. And Peter, who was always interested a little bit more in the mundane things, says, I wanted to ask you whether you thought it would be reasonable for adult cardiology to pay 5% of my salary for the course. Where's Roger? Right here. Oh, there he is. Fellows from pediatric cardiology and pediatric gastroenterology rotate through on an ad hoc basis. Shatera Walker, assistant professor of cardiology, attends the clinic whenever her schedule permits. She has a clinical and research interest in obesity, dyslipidemia, and preventive cardiology. He finally ends up with the thing he dislikes the most. And he said, down at the bottom of the list, the reimbursement that is collected for our services is indeed disappointing. Further, there's an incredible inequity when we spend 30 to 45 minutes dictating the EPR note and then 10 to 15 minutes editing it. We receive no reimbursements for these efforts. The lawyers must laugh at us behind closed doors. So I hope what you get from that is the things that were important to Peter. The clinical care, the field of dyslipidemias, the incredible variety of people that he interacted with both on the faculty and I think in his clinic. But also what really he enjoyed, and that was the teaching, both of the fellows and from a variety of areas. Now, at the end of this interview, I always ask people for their goals for this year. And, you know, Peter was a full professor. He became a professor at 44 when I was an assistant professor, okay? And you would think he would slow down, but he hadn't. He had a manuscript to submit on a triad heart study. He had set up had a collaboration with Dave Valley to test the hypothesis that certain transporters and receptors in apolipoprotein C1 may strongly influence maternal placental cholesterol transport. He started a second follow-up study on young men and women in the dietary intervention study in children. And he was always looking for more money, this time from Merck, to determine whether the distribution of ApoC1 between ApoB atherogenic particles and ApoA1 may be an important mechanism on the effect of niacin on lipoproteins. Now, I am not an unaccustomed academician, but I hope what you got away from that is Peter was constantly trying to do two things in my mind. He was trying to understand something that we really are part of. He was trying to understand. He wanted to push the envelope of knowledge further, and there were lots of ideas, and he had no problem coming up with the ideas. And then I think the other thing was he was interested not only in the physiology, if you will, the sort of science we call it, but he never stood still at that level. He was successful in really revealing some remarkable things, but Peter was constantly involved in clinical trials and clinical interventions. And it was not enough for Peter to have an article in a very prestigious magazine outlining some new physiology if he wasn't actually trying new interventions and trying to find new treatments for the variety of children who came to see him or who he was consulted on. And so, in closing, I would say that although we would do this formal review, Peter and I would constantly talk about my favorite idea, and that was the antecedent of adult disease in children, and perhaps before they're born, with their mothers in utero. And Peter was very, very excited about some new proteins that he had discovered in premature and small gestational infants who we knew had a higher risk of getting cardiovascular disease when they got older. And so he and I would spend a great deal of time, much more than just a review, talking about the future and what the incredible potential of the future was. And so in summary, I think what I remember actually spans an incredible period of time where someone taught, where someone treated, and where someone learned about a field which some of us many of us take for granted right now, and that's the importance of lipids and their impact on later adult diseases. When I first went to him, I really didn't know what HDL and LDL was. I vaguely knew what a cholesterol level was. But I can tell you, as the years went on, I certainly paid attention to mine, okay? And I think it was Peter and his collaborators who really allowed us to broaden the spectrum of this very important field, to offer hope to rare families who had very high cholesterol problems, but also to introduce to all of us the idea that children are important and that the antecedents for many, many common diseases arise in children. And so that's my memory of Peter. And that's some of his own words, which I think highlight in my mind what's very important. We have a series of speakers who will follow each other. They're listed in your book. And then we'll open this up to others who may want to say a few words. So we'll start with Alan Snyderman.
My name is Alan Snyderman. I am the Edwards Professor of Cardiology at McGill University, and I have come to honor Dr. Peter Kwiterovich. I first met Pete when he came to Toronto to talk at a meeting of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. It was the fall of 1978, I think. I wanted to meet him, but there was no opportunity at his lecture. A while later, I saw him pass by in the lobby of the hotel, and I chased after him, leaving my wife in a bar with someone I later learned that she was not particularly fond of. When I came back about an hour or so later, she was not particularly fond of me either. We all survived that first encounter, just Pete and me and my wife, Sarah. Pete and I worked together for several years, and through that time, I saw that Pete embodied the values Johns Hopkins stands for. Doctors whose primary mission is to care for those who entrust their lives to them. Human beings with faces and names. Human beings with dreams and fears. Human beings who are each unique and irreplaceable. Pete was a doctor, as his father was, as my father was. But unlike his father and my father, a doctor with the opportunity to change the world for the better for all those in need. My best time with Pete was when we went to investigate the sudden death of a young Amish man. He was only 13 and he had died about 20 years before. The family lived between Intercourse and Paradise, Pennsylvania. The parents continued to feel the pain of their loss. And whether their faith was broken or sustained, I do not know. But their strength and gentleness made a permanent imprint on Pete and me. They lifted us up and helped us move forward. We published the record of his life in The Lancet. He had hyper-ApoB and cytostrolemia, and Pete carried on to uncover the genetic abnormalities responsible for the cytostrolemia. Pete kept his commitment to that Amish family. When I started at McGill, my research laboratory consisted of one bench and one technician. My equipment was borrowed permanently with permission from the clinical chemistry department. I had no grants, but I put a sign on the door which said Cardiovascular Research Unit. I was a nobody and knew I had to appear to be a somebody. For my stationery, I needed a logo and a motto. I called the classics department at McGill and explained my need to the secretary, a lovely, sympathetic lady who laughed and who asked me if I wanted to speak to the Greek guy or the Latin guy. I picked the Latin guy, and one of our professors of Latin, a kind and positive person, helped me create my motto, Per caritatem inquirimus. What does it mean? Inquirimus means that we inquire, which in our case as physicians means we do research. Per means because. Caritas is charity, but charity really means something done because we care. Per caritatem inquirimus means we do research because we care. A scientist, a real scientist, does research because he or she wants to learn. A physician does research primarily to relieve pain, fear, and suffering. Per caritatem inquirimus fits P to a T. Pete Kwiterovich did research because he cared about the children that he treated and all the other children he could help through his research. Because Pete cared for others, he brought honor to himself and to Johns Hopkins. I am here to honor Pete and Johns Hopkins. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Miller, a professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and I'm proud that Dr. Pete Kwiterovich was my mentor, and really fortunate to have him influence my professional career. So the first time I spoke to Pete, I was a house officer at the University of Cincinnati, and I was interested in going to lipids. And my professor at the time, by the name of Charles Glick, had suggested several institutions to contact, and he said, "You got to call Dr. Kwiterovich." So I got on the phone, and I sent letters out, and he responded back that he'd be interested. I get on the phone, and I said, "Dr. Kwiterovich?" And there was a long pause. And then he said, "Yes." And I said, "This is Mike Miller. I sent you a letter." "Oh, hi, Mike." And then we proceeded to talk, and made an appointment, came out probably a little while later. And he was, as soon as I met him, he was right on the board right there showing me pathways of lipid metabolism. Because Pete was an amazing teacher, and that was fundamentally what he wanted to do. And so for the next hour and a half, I learned all about lipid metabolism from Pete's vantage point, and he told me about the work that he and Alan Snyderman had done, and it was just very uplifting and very stimulating. I knew I wanted to work with Pete. And so over the course of the next several months, and of course, before I left, he said, "Oh, by the way, you have to write an NIH grant. You have 6 weeks to do it." was one of the research proposals for fellowship. And I did, and came back, and then started subsequently with Pete, and it was just a magical experience over the course of the next several years. And the reason it was magical was because not only was Pete a really good teacher, but he was a great listener. He loved to not only converse and hear what you had to say, but then respond in a very meaningful way and provide some insights, especially for someone who was just in training and really not knowing the depth of what Pete had already experienced over the course of a number of years, having been at Hopkins at that point as on faculty for 15 years. Pete wanted us to perform at our best, and he desired the best for us. He took special pride in the people coming out of his lab and making sure they would succeed. And years later, whenever I would see him at a conference, he always wanted to know how I was doing, always focusing not so much on himself, but on how you were doing. That's what made Pete so special. He wanted us to be well prepared and to be able to handle unexpected challenges. So I'm going to tell you an example that really puts this into perspective. And this was at the atherosclerosis meetings in 1988 that took place in Rome. And Pete had a presentation in midweek. He came in on a Sunday and with his slides. Back in those days, the 35mm slides placed into carousel. Well, Pete's briefcase was stolen. But Pete was always well prepared, and so what he did was he contacted, I guess it was Carol McGinley, the secretary at the time, and he had an extra copy on Monday. The presentation was Tuesday, and they sent it over to Rome and had, I guess, a group there, technicians, put slides. And as Pete was ready to give his talk on Tuesday, the person who had made the slides, the technician, ran down to give it to Pete. And Pete put the first slide in and was overexposed. Couldn't interpret any of the slides. Pete was just very calm, and just as a matter of fact, he said, "I don't need these slides anyway." And even though a few people started to leave the room, once Pete started to talk, they came back in. And it was truly an amazing talk. And just, again, taught me that just being prepared means so much, and just a snapshot of how Pete handled that situation with such finesse and grace was really a life experience that we could take, and it stayed with me over the years. Pete was a principal investigator in many cholesterol trials. He was involved in the first trial to show that lowering cholesterol reduced the risk of a heart attack. And when it came to really putting the whole picture together, Pete was, I think, viewed as the world expert as it relates to cholesterol metabolism in children. And he was involved in the very essence of clinical trials, whether it was showing the dietary intervention study in children or using statin therapy to show that you would not impair maturation in adolescence was also important. And Pete led that initiative. His opinion was really revered by world experts. And a number of years ago, I was working with Nobel laureate Joe Goldstein to discuss a very complex case of a young boy who had really high cholesterol. And as we were working through the case, Joe turned to me and asked, very simply, what would Peter do? Pete wasn't only passionate about science, his research and working at Hopkins, but nothing made his eyes glisten more than the pride as he mentioned his family and talked about his family. Now, during my fellowship, I witnessed Pete's pride and joy as he shared with us some of the memorable experiences, including Pete Jr. being selected to the Yale Metro baseball team, as well as Chris going to medical school here. And he was an attentive father. In fact, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I saw, just from a distance, with his bad knees, Pete running to chase Adam through one of the terminals at BWI Airport. But it was Martha who Pete really credited for helping immensely the last few years. And after attending Roger's endowment celebration, I took Pete home, and he told me that Martha would drive him down to Hopkins, picking him up, taking him back, as well as taking care of Adam and Shelton on a daily basis. And he was so appreciative that Martha enabled him to continue doing the work that Pete loved. As serious of a scientist as Pete was during the day, he knew how to party after hours. Whether it was taking our team out to go to Bertha's Mussels or home brewing his famous and potent Veritas. At his annual party, Pete knew the importance of friends, family, as well as work and relaxation. Pete's patients loved him. He made himself available to them at all times, sent them letters after their visits, a practice that was well ahead of its time. But what impressed me most about Pete was his humbleness. He never sought the spotlight or talked about his many accomplishments. We all love Pete, and he was one of the kindest persons I've ever known, and he's greatly missed. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Roger Blumenthal. It's a pleasure to follow my friends Alan Snyderman and Mike Miller and precede Kathy Byrne. 5 years ago, I spoke at a memorial tribute to another great Hopkins physician, Dr. Kenneth Baughman. Along with Ken, Pete Kwiterovich and Simeon Margolis, who is here, were the three most influential and helpful individuals as we started and then progressively expanded the now 25-year-old Henry Hopkins Ciccarone Center for the Prevention of Heart Disease. I started off my tribute to Ken Baughman by quoting Shakespeare, so I'm trying to make it educational for you, Adam and Shelton. Shakespeare once wrote, "To climb steep hills requires slow pace at first." This quote made me think of Pete because he long tried to persuade skeptical patients and physicians, many of whom were cardiologists and cardiac surgeons, about the importance of aggressive cholesterol and risk factor management. Just as Ken Baughman is remembered as the leader of the heart failure cardiomyopathy service at Hopkins, Pete will always be remembered as the true pioneer of atherosclerotic vascular disease at Hopkins. I know Peter is, head of the Gilman Middle School, and Adam, you may have read the Odyssey by Homer, so I thought I'd be literary again for you. The concept of mentoring goes back to the worldly teacher known as Mentor, who agreed to live and work closely with Telemachus, the young son of Odysseus. And Odysseus traveled for some 20 years. Mentor taught his pupil Telemachus to eventually assume the responsibilities of leadership. And that's what mentorship is all about. And Pete taught many of us in this room how to become leaders in medicine. Pete was a pediatrician like my late father, Dr. Stanley Blumenthal, who also trained at Hopkins. Both of these great men preached the art of prevention, and I learned so much from both of them. My father referred more than a dozen patients and their families to Pete over the years. And my dad himself even saw Pete for a consultation. Pete's interest in genetics was nurtured here at Hopkins under the tutelage of our famous Dr. Victor McCusick, the father of modern medical genetics. After Pete graduated from Dartmouth, he spent the summer working with Dr. McCusick on a project with the Amish. Since the Amish did not marry outside their group very much, they were more likely to suffer from inherited diseases. Pete told me the stories about going to farmhouses and drawing blood in barns by candlelight. He was involved in growing cells and doing the genetic characterization known as karyotyping. Pete loved the science and he loved interacting with the patients. This was the path that he followed in his long and storied career, laboratory research related to human disease. He reasoned that if much of human disease is inherited, it's likely to be present in childhood, and that's what led him to go into pediatrics. He was able to collect and compare biochemical and genetic data across multiple generations in families with early heart disease and stroke. His investigative and clinical work over some 45 years helped to delay or prevent premature death and disability for many thousands of young adults. He loved teaching, mentoring, and sharing ideas with two generations of physicians and trainees. His work was the catalyst that directly shaped our approach to screening and cardiovascular disease prevention. The way he set up his lipid center with a strong focus on lifestyle changes for the entire family was the way that we modeled our Hopkins Ciccarone Center in adult cardiology. His work filled in important gaps in our understanding of the evolution of cardiovascular disease across the life spectrum. His colleagues and patients knew him as a walking, talking encyclopedia on vascular disease and cholesterol. They often referred to him as Dr. K. Some of his younger patients even thought that the word cholesterol started with the letter K. Next, I just wanted to share a few reflections from one of our senior fellows, Dr. Seth Martin, who's done some outstanding lipid research with Pete. Seth wrote, "It was a distinct pleasure to work with Pete during the preventive cardiology rotation. From the young patient with familial hypercholesterolemia to the middle-aged woman who had side effects on 5 different statins, to the elderly patient who had had bypass surgery 2 decades before, Pete had been managing for decades. It was a unique opportunity to learn from a legend." Seth wrote that Pete was a big supporter of his research. When working on his first major original research project as a fellow, comparing what's called the Friedewald estimated LDL, or bad cholesterol, to directly measure bad cholesterol, Seth was very keen to find out what Dr. Friedewald himself thought of the work. Seth had trouble connecting with Dr. Friedewald, but Pete was the one that urged him to persist and call Dr. Friedewald directly at Columbia or even at his home. This led to an insightful response from Dr. Friedewald, which meant the world to Seth. Seth further wrote, up until his final months, Pete continued to be a huge supporter of the innovative lipid research that Dr. Jones and Seth were doing. Seth was grateful and humbled for all that Pete did. To have someone who was such a pioneer, who had contributed so much to the field, spend his final months co-authoring papers with our group was truly inspirational. Despite his deteriorating health, Pete continued to persist. Seth finished by saying, "I think the importance of persisting and dedicating yourself to what you're passionate about are just some of the lessons I learned from Pete." And then finally, Pete sent me this note after the ceremony from my endowed professorship. He wrote, "I am thrilled with your endowment that gives you the well-deserved ongoing support for your work and your legacy, Roger. I must mention that you are a wonderful and most generous person, collaborator, and friend. I have been the benefactor as well of sharing time with your brilliant cardiology fellows in the Lipid Clinic, which has so enriched my experience here at Hopkins. It's ironic that Pete was thanking me for sending our fellows to work with him, but Hopkins Cardiology learned so much from Pete. In summary, Pete's career was devoted to unraveling the biochemical and genetic mysteries underlying cardiovascular disease. I look forward to celebrating with many of you in this room when we reconvene to celebrate future endowments in Pete's name to support his remarkable legacy. Thank you."
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Byrne, and I too have had the pleasure of working with Dr. Kwiterovich for many years. You've heard from Dr. Kwiterovich's physician colleagues speak of his many, many accomplishments. I would now like to just take a few minutes to share some thoughts about the man that I came to know and respect, but all with a common theme. I'm so very thankful for the opportunities that have been afforded me over the past 13 years. That would not have been possible if not for working with our Dr. K, as many of you know him as. Under his tutelage, I was able to travel both stateside and abroad, to participate in meetings involved in lipid research, to speak, to publish, and most importantly, to work side by side with a leading scholar in the field of lipidology, learning to care for those with inherited and or complex lipid disorders. Now, prior to my relocation to Maryland several years ago, I had expressed an interest in changing my focus from caring for those with acute cardiovascular problems to a more preventative nature. I had been advised when I was at the University of Pennsylvania to seek out a Dr. Peter Kwiterovich, a well-known researcher and clinician in lipidology. I had no idea who this gentleman was until I began to research him. I dismissed the idea of coming to Hopkins because I was not too terribly keen on making a commute that was more than 1.5 hours from my home out near Frederick. However, almost a year after I had been down to Maryland, I started to leaf through some old nursing journals. And I happened upon one that was several months old with an advertisement for a nurse practitioner to work in the lipid clinic with Dr. Kwiterovich, caring for patients and doing clinical research. I assumed that the position had been filled, but nevertheless, I thought, maybe I should pursue this. My curiosity was piqued as I looked up Dr. Kwiterovich, Googled him, and then I emailed him. I expressed an interest in any future employment opportunities, or perhaps just some projects, and inquired as to whether my background in inpatient cardiology and cardiovascular surgery was suited to the practice. And I was an adult cardiac nurse practitioner. I did not do pediatrics. To my surprise, I received a response within a 15-minute time span. And we spoke for more than an hour later that afternoon about the position. During the conversation, Dr. Kwiterovich, as you have been told before, really sold me on the idea of prevention. And he too began to teach me about lipid metabolism over the phone. He promised to impart the requisite knowledge to me that I needed to care for these patients. I wasn't too sure that that would happen because he was greatly involved with the education of physicians. He was a great man, but Pete remained true to his word and did teach me. This internationally recognized authority on cholesterol always took the time to share his expertise. Not a week passed that he didn't place an article on my desk, discuss new developments in the field, or provide me with references on a topic related to the clinical care of patients. When he encountered a particularly interesting finding during clinic, he would be certain that I was invited into that particular exam room so that I could see and examine the patient. And I so appreciated how he allowed me to learn and to develop. When I sought his advice in the earlier years of practicing with him regarding a therapy or medication to order, he would turn around and say to me, "What do you want to do, Kathy? What do you think is best? Go ahead and try it. Don't be afraid. As long as you're safe, don't worry. You need to develop your practice and your ways of doing things." He was truly an encourager. He fostered my growth and he instilled confidence in me. He gave me several pieces of advice throughout the years that have stayed with me. One, don't be afraid to ask why. Always ask why. Don't accept the status quo. And think outside the box. Because you know, Kathy, I think outside the box. This consummate teacher loved imparting knowledge to all he encountered. The patients, often in terms that were very difficult to understand, the staff, the house staff, the fellows, and the medical community at large. He lectured across the country and across the world, and I was just going over his CV the other day and counted more than 300 publications. He also wrote 2 books that I became very familiar with, Beyond Cholesterol, which was written for the lay public, and the Johns Hopkins textbook of dyslipidemia, which was modeled after the continuing medical education programs in the Lipid Disorders Training Center here at Hopkins, which took place well over 2 decades. Pete was truly devoted to the hundreds of patients that he cared for with lipid disorders because they also taught and challenged him in his clinical practice. He knew his patients, and when I say knew, he really knew them. He was able to rattle off their condition, their lipid levels, a very in-depth family history, and personal information about those individuals without ever referring to a chart. He considered it a privilege to have cared for 3 generations of families with inherited lipid disorders. Prior to his retirement, we spent a great deal of time discussing those individuals for whom he had particular concerns. He left me with specific instruction as to how they should be managed and told me, don't let anyone, Kathy, interfere with that. That was our Pete. I'm going to take you back a few years because a visit to the lipid clinic was more than a doctor's appointment and always lasted more than an hour. In fact, for those of you who have been on the other side of things as his patient, you know that sometimes it was 3 hours, 3.5 hours, okay. But the environment was inviting. Patients sat at round tables adorned with fresh flowers that were provided by our own Ladina Schlickas. After vital signs and blood work were obtained, the patients enjoyed a light breakfast provided by the clinic. This informal setting provided an opportunity for patients to interact, to support one another, and share information with one another. That was before a lot of the HIPAA things, okay? Like I said, visits were never rushed. And if you were the unfortunate staff member who needed to tell Dr. Kwiterovich that there was a backload of patients in the waiting room, you promptly got the message, either verbally or non-verbally, that he was displeased. Displeased? Yes, indeed, because you know I am either teaching, providing counsel, or researching the literature in order to care for a difficult patient. And I can't tell you the number of times that I would walk in and he would be on PubMed researching. And I'd be like, Pete, can we please move on? No, we need to get this settled now. He gave fatherly advice to his patients, and sometimes he found it necessary for that advice to be quite blunt and not sugar-coated. To a smoker, I can clearly remember him saying, "What do you want to do? Die, man?" And for those of you who knew Pete, man was always in his conversation. This is just foolish behavior. It has got to stop. Although these comments were not welcomed initially, they certainly did often produce the necessary lifestyle changes. Peter could also be very gentle, and he had a calming effect on his patients, whether it be the very young or the very old. I was most impressed the very first day that I walked into the lipid clinic to shadow him, and his demeanor and his soothing voice served to calm a distressed, screaming toddler. He just had that ability. The close bonds that he established over the years with his patients have not been forgotten by them. They continue to share their heartfelt thankfulness for the care he has rendered. With the realization that his illness would require that he would retire sooner than he desired, many of his final clinic visits with patients were spent imparting wisdom and giving advice for life. to one young woman for whom he had cared since she was a very young girl, he emphasized the absolute necessity of choosing a spouse who would be fully supportive of her medical condition. To others, he gave a lingering hug. And after those encounters, there were many tears shed as his patients realized that he was giving his final goodbye. Pete loved life, and he loved his family. He talked a great deal about the accomplishments of his 3 older children, Peter, Chris-Ann, and Karen, and he provided very funny anecdotes about Adam and Shelton. He spoke of fishing, of days spent on the boat at the cliffs, of his vacations to the beach. And who can forget, as has already been mentioned, his annual holiday event, Veritas, where friends and colleagues came together and shared in his especially concocted libations. And you know, it was always a great thing to hear Pete's very, very deep belly laugh that would erupt from his office. Ha, 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 when he heard a funny story or a joke. Now, having said these things, I would certainly be remiss if I didn't tell you that Peter Kwiterovich was the most challenging personality, the most challenging physician that I have worked with over a 36-year time span. He could be feisty, he could be demanding, and he could often be colorful with the use of the English language. We spoke of this on several occasions, and he would laugh and say, "No way, Kathy. I'm a really easygoing guy, right?" I would say, "You are so right, Pete." And yet, I have to tell you, despite having a temperament that was quick to flare, that man never, ever held a grudge that I know of. A quality that is very rare and something I appreciated. He said what needed to be said. That was the end of it, and we moved on. This healer was passionate about his work and expected all individuals working with him to share the same level of dedication that he had. So be it that one was required to work into the wee hours of the morning to complete a grant application, or to finalize a poster presentation, or you have personal plans for the weekend, but you do know we have to accommodate those research subjects who are in school during the week. We just have to do this. But we do remember, all of us, that this was done to further the development of lipidology and ultimately result in improved patient care. In closing, I must tell you, I miss my mentor and friend. I miss joking with him, I miss sparring with him, and having him fill me up with knowledge. I would give anything to hear his voice coming from across the hall again. This man witnessed and participated in the maturation of the field of lipidology over the past 50 years. I would say to his patients, remember his sage words and apply them to your lives. And to those who have worked with him, his colleagues, staff, remember that he has passed on the torch to us, and we have a lot to live up to. Thank you.
Okay, and now through the power of technology, we have Peter Blum on the phone from Atlanta. Peter, can you hear us? Hold on. Try it again, Peter.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I wish I were there in person. It is an honor to talk about my close friendship with Pete Kwiterovich for more than a quarter of a century. Perpetuating the memory of such a great human being is important to all of us who are privileged to have known Pete and appreciate his many contributions. Pete's loss is profound, and I miss him very much. Even though his death was expected, I must admit I was not prepared. In his Johns Hopkins textbook of dyslipidemia, Pete described the book to me, and I'll read it. It's dated October 29, 2009, to Peter Blum, a superb human being, best friend, and confidant. May you enjoy the first of my author's books. With warmest regards, always Pete. And his beautiful inscription in his book Beyond Cholesterol in March 1990 is also so meaningful to me. When I first visited Dr. Kwiterovich, I should share with you that my HDL was in the low 20s, and I was diagnosed with hyper-ApoB, the double whammy he referred to in his book. I recall how impressed I was to be diagnosed by the man who co-discovered ApoB with Dr. Snyderman. Pete would come to Atlanta every so often for a speaking engagement or a convention, and we would always get together for dinner. I would like to share a story with you about my having dinner with Pete probably more than 25 years ago, what was then Atlanta's best restaurant, Panos and Paul. He ordered the house specialty, a battered fried lobster tail, creamy appetizer of lump crab meat, even some French fries, and then for dessert, ice cream and a rich cake. I looked at him incredulously and said, Pete, I'm going to tell all of your patients what you ate. He responded with his inimitable laugh, and then sheepishly told me that anything in moderation is not that bad. And when he said that, he knew he wasn't to be taken literally. But for so many years thereafter, Pete would still talk about this particular great meal that we enjoyed together. Pete and I had much in common. Both of our fathers were doctors. We both studied Latin. We both were diagnosed with prostate cancer. We both had the same pre-surgical Gleason 7 scores. My surgery taking place in 2001, and his about 19 months following mine. I'm convinced the reason Pete lived so long with metastatic disease is because he understood the underlying mechanisms and possible innovative treatment options, as well as most oncologists. Pete was a devoted husband and father. He was a humanitarian. He was a scholar, a teacher, a scientist, a researcher, and a most gifted physician who never tooted his own horn. The manner in which he treated people, his patients in particular, spoke volumes about what kind of person Pete was. In the words of his friend and colleague, Dr. Shuberto Chatterjee, Pete was a, quote, perfect gentleman from the beginning to the end. Pete loved his family, his wife Martha, his children, Chris, Karen, Peter, Adam, and Sheldon, and his grandchildren. Can't begin to tell you how much joy his family brought to his life. Pete loved his patients and his colleagues and cared deeply about their problems. He enjoyed having holiday parties at his home and invited colleagues and friends. As has been mentioned by Dr. Miller, I believe, and Kathy, he would like to serve a Lithuanian hot punch called Virtas. Pete loved Hopkins. Of all of his many accomplishments, I think becoming a full professor at Hopkins at the age of 44 meant the most to him. Pete was responsible for bringing to Johns Hopkins one of the first 12 lipid clinics established by the NIH in 1971. He changed the medical profession's understanding of lipid metabolism and the role it plays in premature heart disease. He was a pioneer in lipidology and preventative cardiology, an internationally recognized authority on familial hypercholesterolemia, and his career represented a study of its presentation in childhood. I would like to briefly recognize some of Pete's closest assistants. Dean Swikas was with Pete for 40 years. Hazel Smith was with him until she died. I believe she was with him for 17 years. Pauline Gugliana, 13 years, and I believe Kathy was with him 13 years as well. Donna Virgil, his research specialist, tech for 34 years, and Dr. Shiberto Chatterjee collaborated with him for some 35 years. Pete worked 24 hours a day on grants. There were no computers when he and Pauline would go and work nonstop for 30 hours when SCORE grants consisting of more than 200 pages were due. After work on Friday evenings, Pete would always join 20 or more in the group for happy hour. I would always get a laugh when Pete would tell me, "Peter, the man is brilliant, but he curses at his computer." And many times when I would visit at Hopkins, I would be walking toward his desk, or his office rather, and I would hear him talking as if someone were in the room. And I'm sure some of you, or most of you, remember, he would say out loud when he was angry, "Jesus H. Christ, for Christ's sake." And I thought he was really someone there, but it was just the computer. Pete used to have his own lab in the clinic. He had an analyzer, and his patients would get their results in less than 15 minutes. He had over 2,500 active patients at any one time. He provided breakfast for his patients, sometimes just orange juice, coffee, toast, tea, graham crackers, jelly, because he knew they had been fasting. Pete made it a practice of coming out to the reception room to greet each patient and bring them back to his office. And I believe his patients consisted of about 70% adults and 30% children. Pete initially started his own fundraising by sending out letters and did not ask the development office for help at that time. He began having annual galas in the early 90s, and there were silent auctions to raise money. I remember bringing a signed Tom Glavine jersey, and it was really something to watch Pete dancing the electric slide. I still have on my desk a silver cup marking the 20th anniversary of the Lipid Clinic, as well as a beautiful glass paperweight from the 92 gallery. Kathy mentioned 3 generations of families that were his patients. In doing some research, I find that it was at least 4 and possibly 5 generations of patients. This by itself in clinical practice is mind-boggling. A number of department chairmen at Hopkins were his patients. There were 3 children who suffered from hypercholesterolemia that were brought to Hopkins in the 70s and 80s to be treated by Pete, and each had a great effect on him. Tracy Picard was just 6 or 7. She came from Japan in 1975 or 76. She was initially set to go to the NIH, but his colleague there referred her to Pete. And then there was Barbara Allen, who was about 9 or 10 in the mid-80s. And lastly, there was JJ, who was 9 when he arrived from India in the late 80s, with his cholesterol being over 3,000 I got to know JJ, and he was an exceptional young man. Pete became JJ's medical guardian. He was able to bring his cholesterol down to about 800 by the use of plasmapheresis, an exchange of plasma every 2 weeks, which decreases the amount of LDL cholesterol in the blood. I recall just how hard Pete took JJ's death. While he was able to bring down or eliminate xanthomas or plant sterols the size of tennis balls, all 3 children died of inflammation. But looking back, Pete understood that these were pre-statin days. Dr. Shuberta Chatterjee collaborated with Pete for 35 years, as I mentioned, and they published about 20 peer-reviewed scientific publications. Pete asked Schubert to write a chapter in this textbook. They shared a U.S. patent, and their research in molecular biology led to the development of drugs for the prevention of atherosclerosis and its cure in mice, as well as the function of ApoC1. Schubert describes Pete as a great friend, a student, a buddy, a lover of science, and a, quote, down-to-earth scientist. He refers to him as Dr. Cholesterol, a man with an amazing depth of the whole field who could put things together like a magician. Pete's integrity, honesty, curiosity, and modesty were the qualities that Dr. Chatterjee and so many of his friends and patients admired. But it was his focus that he and Donna, that Dr. Chatterjee and Donna believed set him apart from others. He had a colony of ApoB rabbits in his hospital lab that I saw in some of my visits to Hopkins. It was an animal model for familial combined hypercholesterolemia and was the only one of its kind in the United States. Ultimately, it became too expensive to maintain due to budget constraints. I just have a few more comments and remarks. The late Dr. Arnold Patz, one of the world's most famous ophthalmologists, was a patient of Pete's, and Pete introduced me to him. Dr. Patz, who developed one of the first argon lasers, was a co-recipient of the Albert Lasker Award for his discovery of the cause of childhood blindness due to high doses of oxygen given to premature infants, the cause of Stevie Wonder's blindness. Dr. Patz was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2004. And he told me that he considered Pete's work to be more important than his because of how many lives that could be saved. Dr. Patz also told me that he wished he were younger so he could build the Kwiterovich Lipid Research Building at Hopkins, much in the same way that he was instrumental in bringing about the Wilmer Eye Institute. What is so remarkable is just how much Pete was able to accomplish while he was sick, when he continued to see patients and lecture until the end of last April. Pete never gave up. He was revered by his colleagues, Alan Fogelman, Roger Brown, and the speakers here today, to name just a few. No physician was more dedicated, more brilliant, and more caring than Pete. He provided concierge medicine to his patients without charging them for the service. May his many accomplishments and the way he conducted himself serve as an inspiration to those who follow in his footsteps. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Chris Ann Ausler, Peter's oldest daughter, and I have a very few remarks. I do want to thank, on behalf of my family, Dr. Dover and the rest of the speakers, and in fact, all of you here, for coming here to honor my father. It means a great deal to my family, and I know he would be very pleased. Today you've heard many wonderful remarks about Dr. Kwiterovich's achievements as a clinician, a researcher, and most of all, an educator. I was fortunate to have him as both a mentor and a father and a friend. I think his role as a father speaks the most of his unique accomplishments. Intellectual curiosity, insight, perseverance, vision, these are the characteristics of a leader in a scientific field, attributes that I know many individuals in this room share with him. I think what makes Peter Oscar Kwiterovich Jr. exceptional is that he was a singular scientist, a great father, and a devoted friend, all at the same time. As you've heard, a couple anecdotes. My father loved the water. Weekends as kids were spent on the Chesapeake Bay on our motorboat, fishing and crabbing. Later, he got a summer cottage that overlooks the Chesapeake Bay. This was our home base for kayaking and fishing trips. Father's Day tradition became a crab feast on the deck. As you know, he's a great sports enthusiast. He made it a point to go to all of the children's games. Consider the fact that he had 5 children with many diverse sports, and over many decades, this is quite an accomplishment. These are fond memories, of course, but in retrospect, I realize that they're exceptional in the setting of his accomplishments in medicine that occurred during the same time. In 1972, at the age of 32, as you've heard, he founded the Lipid Research Clinic, and he drove me to grade school every morning. The year I graduated from high school, he became a tenured professor. My father, during the course of all this, gave no indication whatsoever of the demands and rigors of his work. The only sign was his absent-mindedness, the forgetful professor, as you may recall. I now personally can recognize this is a symptom of chronic sleep deprivation. The childhood memory of waking up at home and finding him working in that blue robe at his desk before breakfast now makes sense. A Jesuit-trained scholar, he practiced what St. Francis preached. Live as if you were to die tomorrow. Work as if you were to live forever. Many of us work and play hard, proverbially burning the candle at both ends. My father's talent was that he was completely engaged in the moment, in the present, with a passionate, singular focus. Throughout his life and his career, he maintained the capacity to laugh out loud. Kathy did a wonderful rendition, which I cannot repeat. This robust belly laugh is actually one of my favorite cherished memories, as it sounds like it is of others. If you do not understand how remarkable this is during the course of those accomplishments, ask yourself in your daily life, when was the last time you laughed out loud like that? My father gave me a copy of William, excuse me, almost made it to 9, only 2 more lines. My father gave me a copy of William Osler's Meaning of Life, and I wanted to read a very short, brief passage. Now, the way of life that I preach is a habit to be acquired gradually by long and steady repetition. It is the practice of living for the day only, for the day's work. Life in day-tight compartments. This is my father's accomplishment that is not included in the curriculum vitae, and I pass it to you as part of his legacy. Thank you all for being here.
So we have a few minutes. Are there others who would like to say a few words? Please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pete's youngest sister. I'm the baby. It's good to be the baby, especially when you reach a certain age. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to share just a few thoughts, some Beatle memories of my big brother, a little about his roots, and then I'd like to end with a poem. My big brother was always the biggest to me, and he really became a giant when in 1965, in the midst of my Beatlemania, he patiently waited in line to get tickets for me and the whole family to go see the Beatles live and in person right here in Baltimore. It was wonderful. Of course, we couldn't hear anything, but we could see them. However, I wasn't too good about sharing the binoculars. But I'll always thank you, Peter, for that wonderful experience. And that Christmas, he was assigned to bring home the latest Beatle album from the big city of Baltimore to our little town of Danville. And he came to the door with a very woeful look on his face and said, "I'm really sorry, the store was all sold out." And of course, Christmas was ruined. I ran up to my room. I wasn't going to go to midnight mass. A few moments later, I hear a knock on the door. He's, "Debbie, come on downstairs. There's the album under the tree." And as we all talked about his belly laugh, you can imagine his laughing. And that was really the sweetest album because I thought I wasn't going to have it. But that was my playful brother with his great sense of humor. In addition to these Beatle memories, I wanted to speak for a moment about his roots and about our parents. Peter's parents loved him, their firstborn, loved him endlessly. And he had Scotch-Irish on his mother's side, and as many of you might know, Lithuanian on his father's side. His father's ancestors came from Lithuania, and his grandfather worked in the coal mines. So Pete's father knew that he did not want to work in the coal mines. And in the middle of the Depression, he found the resources to go to medical school, to college and to medical school, and become a psychiatrist. His parents knew the value of education, and they wanted to generously provide an excellent education for Pete. And he grew up surrounded by this value of education, their love, their generosity, and the dedication to family and the profession. So my siblings and I really grew up with this wonderful foundation. We all did our best to exemplify these qualities and then to pass them on. My sister to her daughter Penny, myself to my son Benjamin, and Pete to his children and his grandchildren. So we see the cycle continues. I'd like to end with a poem which was written by Dr. Horace V. Pike. He was a colleague of my father's and Peter's father, and he was a psychiatrist and a mentor for our father in Danville, Pennsylvania. It's entitled, "My Wish." Life's harp now tuned to concert pitch shall someday muted be, and other hands shall strike the chords that now are formed by me. And when I've played my final note and my song of life is done, of all the things I might desire, I wish for only one. I want no costly resting place in which to sleep the hours. I want no shaft of granite, no eulogies, no flowers. I only wish, and oh, I hope this wish may realized be, that in the lives I've tried to mend, there'll be a niche for me. I know Peter would be so humbly pleased about this wonderful tribute, to see all of you here and to know there is a special niche for him in the hearts and memories of all of us. Thank you.
Please.
Hi, Martha, Shelton, Adam. I'm Nelson Adlin. I was a patient of Dr. Kwiterovich for way over a decade. Somebody has to represent the mundane. I heard all kinds of wonderful scientific explanations of what Pete did. I don't know any of that. I have his book, It was written for the layman, but I must confess I'm waiting for the musical. At any rate, the thing that I wanted to emphasize, and I'll try to make it brief, is that I looked forward, I loved going to Pete's clinic. I can't emphasize that too much. It is so important from the patient's point of view. I am currently an oncology patient, and I can assure you I do not look forward to going to clinic. So when Kathleen talked about the spread of goodies at the clinic, that was a plus. There was a camaraderie, there was a lot of laughter. The assistants many times would bake a special cake, and sometimes patients would bring things. And the ambiance was so wonderful. That does not happen automatically. That came from Pete. Pete, on the other hand, did not suffer fools easily. He ran a tight ship. So you got this wonderful combination of perfection and scientific rule breaking and going to the extremes, and the ambiance that he was able to merge with it. That merger became morphed into, many of us, a wonderful social event called Veritas, in which Pete made his special ethnic drink. And I can assure you that once you took that drink, you forgot about your cholesterol and, unfortunately, even your wife's name. Then we repaired to a spread that is worthy of mention, and Peter Blum did mention it when he went out with Dr. Kwiterovich. It was something that would never pass muster cholesterol-wise, but as Pete said, in moderation, and it was okay in moderation. And when we talked at Veritas, he remembered everything about you. I was fortunate enough to give him a print of mine which he hung in a significant place in his house. And he would always take me and other people at the celebration to look at the print. It was a personal touch, and he did that with everybody. He knew so much about everybody, and there was a family. There was a strange, wonderful family. And I can't emphasize it too much. It does not happen automatically, and we miss Pete, and we love Pete. And I enjoyed Pete, and he saved me long enough so that I could visit the oncology clinic. Oh! Thank you, Pete. Thank you, everybody.
Hello, I'm Brian Kroll. I'm an assistant professor of medicine here, but a long time ago, actually, I was an undergraduate and befriended my first Pete Kwiterovich, happened to be the third. Years later, I went to medical school here, and my mentors, Lou and Diane Becker, introduced me to him as I was starting some of my first scientific projects on lipids and lipoprotein subfractions. And right away, I found out that the junior was actually the senior of my friend, and that he was even a little bit more relaxed, and he had an open door policy. He treated me like a friend and colleague, even as a young student, which is not something you see every day. He had an open door policy, and we did some great things together. Later, as a fellow through Roger and the Ciccarone Center, he continued teaching me, and it never stopped. But I'm really here to read from Lou and Diane Becker. They could not be here. They're both professors and longtime friends of Pete. They really wish they could be, so they asked me to read something for them. Lou and Pete graduated from Hopkins Medical School in 1966, and they remained close colleagues. 35 years ago, Pete offered Diane Becker the opportunity to have lipids measured for free on her study families. This was part of her PhD thesis, thus being instrumental in forming the Johns Hopkins GeneStar Family Heart Study, where Pete continued as a core investigator until his illness. Diane and Lou write, and this is short, but it's true. I've heard the story from all parties involved many times. Working closely with Pete offered a rare insight into his Jack Nicholson-style humor and his enjoyment of telling volleys of jokes. On one occasion, at the American Heart Association, after successful presentations in New Orleans, they celebrated with a few hurricanes and an evening of Zydeco bagpipes and music at Tipitina's, home of the Neville brothers. Diane and Lou, Paul Bacharach, and Dean Martha Hill from the School of Nursing squeezed into a taxi to return to their hotels with Pete as he shared joke after joke. Seized with nonstop gales of hysterical laughter all around, including the taxi driver, they rode for 20 minutes when the driver turned around and asked, "Okay, where to?" As a serious scientist, it may be a surprise to know that Pete was always the life of a party, a natural comedian, and he charmed everyone. He often said, "I work hard and I play hard too." We will miss him dearly and offer our most profound sympathy to Martha and his family. Truly one of a kind, Pete will live forever in the hearts and minds of all who knew him.
I guess I have to use this thing. A little too short. My name is Lynn Riley, and I'm here representing the patients. I know you doctors often get people coming in and going out, and you don't even know what happened to them. Well, my husband is sitting over there, and he's a medical miracle, thanks to the good services of Dr. Peter Kwiterovich, because he's pushing 79, and his father keeled over at 40 of a sudden heart attack. And when he was 35 and an engineer at the Applied Physics Lab, they came around testing cholesterol, looking for subjects for a study, and Pat there found out that he was in the top 3% of the country for bad cholesterol at 35, and his father died at 40. So we realized that he had a problem. And I don't remember when he came here first, but our family doctor couldn't help him anymore, and he said, "Go to Hopkins. There's a guy there who knows everything that you need to, everything known." And he was a patient of Dr. Peter Kwiterovich for at least 30 years, if not more. And he's still here, and he hasn't had to be carved up by the surgeons. And he has had a bad profile, and he doesn't respond to diet and exercise, and he has all the bad side effects from all the medications. So Dr. Kwiterovich was constantly dealing with giving him a different cocktail of medications and seeing what would work and what would be better, and nothing is really perfect, but he was always doing that dance. And here he is, going to conferences and playing his instruments and having fun and with his grandchildren. And I'd like to thank you folks. I know there's a lot of medical people here. You spend your lives helping people, really putting forth a lot of effort and emotional caring, helping people live a long life. And there he is over there. And his father wasn't. So thank you.
I didn't think I was going to do this. I'm the dreaded mother-in-law. I'm Martha's mother, and I'm thrilled to death to know that everybody seems to be settling in and enjoying the fact that they have wonderful memories of Pete, as do I. I suppose I should attribute to Pete the fact that I'm also here. I went to a lot of Veritas. Oh yeah, but I didn't drink it because I've been diabetic forever. And so he understood that, and I had other things offered to me that worked pretty well. And I got to meet all the children and all the grandchildren and a lot of the friends, and we just had a wonderful time. But the reason I think Pete is why I'm here is because I had a round of breast cancer surgery a couple of years ago, and Martha went with me to the various doctors and so forth. And we had one in particular who was really obnoxious, and she said that, how could anybody know more than I know? Remember that one? And I said, well, why don't you just give me all the paperwork that you'd come up with, and I'll get Martha's husband to look at it. And she said, well, who is he? And I said, well, he's at Johns Hopkins. And she said, but is he an oncologist? And I said, I bet he knows a few. And because of that, I think that Pete saved me from dying of the effects of chemo. And he saved me from dying from an overload of radiation. And by the time I was ready, and I've been taking my time with this, to deal with the other medicine, he also suggested I might want to get a different oncologist. And I have done the same. So I really think he saved my life more than once. He, when I was taking some medicine and I didn't like the results of it, he would call my doctor and tell her, well, you know, I think she ought to be taking thus and so. And I took it for a long time. And then he said, I think she should be taking thus and so else. And I took that for a long time. And I didn't take anything like as much insulin as that the earlier doctors wanted me to take. And on the whole, I kind of think he saved my life. And I am just so very pleased that he was my son-in-law. Thank you all.
I promised Dr. Dover I'd be really, really brief. Like a number of other people here, I'm on the faculty, but I'm not here in that capacity. I'm here as a patient of Dr. Kwiterovich. I've been going to see him for almost 3 decades. I can date it exactly. And all these things that people have said are true, including the breakfast and the snacks, etc. They were peculiarly a 550 building phenomena. They did not follow on to Jayhawk or to the building over here or to the pediatric building. I don't know. In terms of Dr. Kwiterovich, I, like everybody else, can thank him for being around. But that's not really why I sort of wanted to stand up here and tell one story and 2 examples of it. I know Kathy referred to the fact that Dr. Kwiterovich was somewhat intolerant of people who wouldn't take care of themselves, if they were smoking, etc., etc. But he was also very, very, very complimentary of people who took care of themselves well. However, he had a very unusual way of imparting that information to the patients. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. You know, the routine was that you'd go to the clinic 3 times a year, every 4 months, not so much to check your lipid levels, but rather to rule out the side effects of the medications you were on. And I remember on one particular occasion, a while back now, I was at the clinic and we were chatting at the end of the visit, and he says, you know, you had a big birthday recently. I said, yeah, I was 50. And he said, you do realize, he said, you do realize, Dan, that 50% of the people with your specific profile have had a major cardiovascular event by the age of 50, and 50% of them are dead. But you're doing great. And then fast forward 7 years and 21 clinic visits later. It's a couple of years back now. I'm again at the clinic, and we're having the conversation at the end of the clinic visit and talking about trials and this and that. And he said, you do realize, Dan, he said, that 100% of the people with your profile have had a major cardiovascular event by the age of 57, and 50% of them are dead. But that's untreated, of course, in the way that with the way you're taking care of yourself, you're doing fantastic. So that was his way of sort of paying compliments. Not exactly traditional, but he was a great person to go to, and someone for whom I have a lot of thanks to give.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jennifer Doyle, who helped us put this together. I can't tell you the number of people I've bumped into who've told me that they have been to Peter Kwiterovich's clinic. So it's really gratifying to hear these stories, because I think he probably enjoyed them more than most of you did. That clinic will continue. We hope with an endowment that we can make it a bigger and better clinic. It will be the Peter O. Kwiterovich Jr. Lipid Clinic. In addition, as Roger mentioned, we intend to continue to bring experts in to talk to us about what Peter's dream was. And that was a dream that someday we'll be able to prevent diseases rather than putting stents in them or watching them go to ICUs. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all. Each one of you have brought a very special message to someone we all have held in very, very high esteem. We hope you'll enjoy mixing a little bit more outside. I won't tell you what the cholesterol levels are. Thank you all for coming.